Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Lakshmi Narula, Associate Professor in Zoology from SGTB Khalsa College, University of Delhi. Today we are going to talk on module Population Growth Regulation from the paper Principles of Ecology. After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the natural regulation of population, about the intrinsic and extrinsic mechanisms of population regulation, about the biotic and abiotic factors, about intraspecific and interspecific competition, about the effect of stress on the endocrine imbalance due to overcrowding, and about the competition for food, space, and mate. The number of plants and animals are fixed and are at equilibrium in nature. Deviation from equilibrium as described in Bible are a result of punishment sent by the divine power. The actual theories of natural regulation of population were proposed by the biologist only after Darwin. Since the time of early Greeks, it was mentioned in the natural history that there is a balance of nature. Populations do not grow indefinitely, rather they tend to remain stable. As the population density changes, the interactions between the individuals of the same population and the different populations as well as the environment tend to regulate the size of the population. As it is clear from this curve, you can say that there is a stable population at asymptote and there are fluctuations or oscillations around the asymptote. At this stable population, dn upon dt, that is the rate of population growth, is 0. As it is clear from this curve that the population density tends to remain stable at asymptote, even though there are fluctuations and oscillations. The equilibrium density is denoted as dn upon dt is equal to 0. The population regulatory mechanisms were explained slightly different by Peter Stilling. Bottom-up factors, which are the thermodynamic factors, they are related to the food chain as explained by Lindemann trophic dynamic model. Only 10% of the energy is transferred between the successive levels and a very little is left for the fourth and the fifth trophic level. As a result of this, the populations at each trophic level are regulated by the previous trophic level. The second category of the factors explained by Peter Stilling is top-down factors, which emphasize on the role of natural enemies in a community such as parasite, predator and diseases. They regulate the population size. As there is an increase in the population density, these diseases may become epidemic and reduce the population density. This was explained by Hairston, Smith, Stobodkin, and it was named by Laurie Ockenson as the hypothesis named as ecosystem exploitation hypothesis, shortly called as EEH. Another way of classifying the population regulatory mechanisms is extrinsic mechanisms and intrinsic mechanisms. The extrinsic mechanisms or the factors are the regulatory factors independent of population density and can lead to more drastic fluctuations in a population. Intrinsic mechanisms are also called as autoregulatory feedback mechanisms or density dependent factors as they are influenced by the population density. These factors result in oscillations in a population. All populations have a tendency to evolve towards the self-regulatory mechanisms. As you can see in this video that the insect population is affected by the extrinsic factors such as disease, competition, climatic factors, predation and parasitism. These extrinsic factors act upon them and lead to the increased mortality. The intrinsic regulatory factors are due to increase in the population density, as it is clear from this slide that as there is an increase in the population density, the individuals of the same population are competing for space and food. As a result, they fight with each other and there is a decline in the population density. Gradually, it becomes so low that again they get enough food and space for themselves and they start reviving their population. As we have seen in the video, the extrinsic mechanisms include the physical and the climatic factors, density-independent population interactions, anthropogenic factors, diseases, predation, and resource availability. The physical components include climate, soil, wind, water currents, and the chemical factors. Light and temperature play an important role in reproduction. In some populations, the growth rate depends on the day length and determines the availability of the food, the growth of the adults and the offsprings, and the development of gonads. For example, in case of weaver birds, it reproduces only during the summer months when the day length is long, and besides food, the long photoperiod is also required for the growth and development of spermatogenesis in case of males. The second example of the effect of physical factors on the population is observed in kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rat in desert can withstand arid condition, but it reproduces only in the month of January after autumn rains. This is because the rain stimulates the growth of herbaceous succulent plants that provide sufficient moisture and the humid conditions required by the kangaroo rat for its reproduction. Density-independent population interactions. Another important factor that regulate the population density are the coexistence of the two populations. When they are coexisting, the interactions can be positive, negative, or neutral. The positive interactions are mutualism, which means that it is an obligatory interaction between the two populations. They cannot coexist. Therefore, this is one of the most important regulatory population factor. The second one is commensalism, which is like a paying guest in which only one of the population is benefited and the other population remains neutral. The benefited population growth is dependent upon the host population. The other type of interactions are the negative interactions. The negative interactions lead to a population decline, and the most commonly observed negative interactions are predation, where one population is completely exhausted by another population; parasitism, where the host and parasite interaction control each other's population. The third is competition. Competitions are of large different types: scramble and interference type of competition. Amensalism is in which the two populations coexist, and only when they come in contact with each other, one of the population is harmed by another population. Commensalism is converse of amensalism. In commensalism, one population is benefited, whereas in amensalism, one population is inhibited. The inhibited population may be called amensal, and in case of commensalism, the population which is benefited is known as the commensal. All the negative interactions lead to a decline in the population density. The positive interaction lead to an increase in the population growth. Thus, in nature, both the positive and negative interactions, they have a simultaneous effect in regulating the population density. Human land use drastically affects the habitat of all other organisms. Deforestation for urbanization, industrialization, and transport has made many wild animals homeless and curtailed their population growth. All types of pollutions and global warming have resulted in the unfavorable environment for many species and are leading to the reduction of wild species, even the extinction of some of them. The recent extinction of dodo and reduction in the number of vultures and sparrows are due to the skyscraper buildings and the electromagnetic waves produced by ICTs. Primarily, it is the growing human population that is using most of the resources for itself and creating an unfavorable habitat for manipulating the environment for its own comforts without keeping in mind the requirements of the other species and their needs. Diseases can act in both the density dependent as well as the density independent regulators of population. Disease becomes an epidemic at high population density. For example, decline in crater lion population by rabies. The crater lion population may have become unusually vulnerable to the infectious disease in the recent years owing to its close proximity to the growing human population and a history of close inbreeding. Unvaccinated domestic dogs are the most important reservoirs for the canine distemper virus. Inbreeding reduces the genetic diversity and the efficiency of mammalian immune response. Thus, the top predator of Ngorongoro crater appears to have been regulated by top-down process over the past 16 years. Greater competition leads to the decreased number of offsprings in the next generation. Predation and resource availability is also an extrinsic population regulator. It belongs to the top-down process according to Peter Stilling. As the prey population size increases, its rate of predation increases. Since it is easily available to the predator, the prey is also one of the resource for the predator. But at low density, predator changes its preference for the prey and it moves to an alternative prey easily available to it. As a result of this, the first prey, which was declining in its population density, starts recovering and the population size again increases for the predator to attack it again. The prey population is thus regulated by the predator population. The intrinsic control mechanism is basically the intraspecific competition for common requirements and stress due to overcrowding. The competition in the populations is mainly for food, space, and meat. These affect the carrying capacity of the population, leading to the leveling of the population growth and its density. At low densities, the organisms do not compete for the resource, whereas at the higher densities, the resources may become limiting and the population size can no longer increase, resulting in the sigmoid-shaped growth curve. The main effect on the population is due to stress that affects the genetic quality and causes the endocrine imbalance, reducing the growth and reproduction. K. Meyer and his co-worker performed the experiments with the old world rabbit. They kept the rabbit at several different densities and at the different living places confined to their habitat. The rabbits living in the smaller spaces suffered the maximum. They were very aggressive, particularly the females. The reproduction declined. The kidney, spleen, adrenal and liver were greatly affected in their size and function. The young ones produced from these also showed the stunted growth. On the other hand, the rabbits from the medium to low densities showed an excellent growth and survival. As it is clear from this flow diagram that as the population density increases, there is an increased social pressure on all the individuals of the population. This leads to a stress on them, and stress affects the endocrine glands of the individual. Most affected are the adrenal and the pituitary gland. As these glands are affected, they lead to a decrease in the reproduction and increase in the mortality of the individuals of the population. Decreased reproduction and increased mortality result in the decreased population density. As a result of this, there is a decrease in the social pressure on the individuals and the population starts regaining again. Effect of competition. Competition in the individuals of a population is especially for food, space, and meat. Competition for food can be divided into two types. One, the scramble type, and two, contest type. Scramble type of competition when the resource is not in short supply, but at high population density, the excess of resource is obstructed and the resource is destroyed or wasted in this process. In contest type of competition, the stronger individuals of the population consume the major share of the resource and the weaker individuals get insufficient amount for their survival. Nicholson performed a series of experiments to demonstrate the effect of food availability on the population of adult and larval blowfly, that is Lucilia cuprina. In his experiment, he reared a culture of blowflies containing both the adult and the larvae. Separate food was used for both. The adults were given dry sugar and the larvae were fed on the beef liver. The population of adults showed constant oscillations. In his first experiment, he provided sufficient food for both adult as well as larvae. In the second one, he provided surplus food for the adults and the limited food for the larvae. In the third experiment, he reversed the condition and provided a constant daily quota of food to the adults and the surplus food to the larvae. In all these combinations of experiments, he could show the oscillations in the population. And surprisingly, he found that the oscillations in the peak value of the adults and the eggs were alternating with each other. Based upon this, Petelka proposed a hypothesis commonly referred to as the Petelka hypothesis for food and shelter. According to Petelka, when there is an increase in the population density or the population reaches its peak value, there is a severe depletion of food, vegetation or foliage. This reduces the quantity of the food as well as the quality of food. Simultaneously, there is a shortage of coverage for the individuals. As a result of this, the populations show increased mortality and a reduced rate of reproduction. On the other hand, shortage of cover leads to an increased rate of predation. This causes an decrease in the number of individuals. And when there is a decrease in the number of individuals, simultaneously there is a gradual recovery of the foliage or the vegetation so that the sufficient food is again available to the remaining individuals. When they get sufficient quantity and quality of food, the population is regained and again it starts increasing and it may lead to another cycle of the peak numbers. The competition for space and mate leads to a social behavior in many animals. The social response is generally observed for space as well as mate. It may function as a regulator of the population. Social interactions among the individuals of a population may involve agonistic or the aggressive behavior. It may lead to a hierarchy development in the individual, the dominance or the territorial behavior, which can lead to the formation of the social groups. They are like flocks, herds, schools, or the loose colonies. Social hierarchy is also called pack order. The most dominant individuals in the population are called alpha. Next in hierarchy are beta, and the last ones are omega or the peripheral ones. They get the minimum of the resource. Once the social hierarchy is established in a population, the newcomers are rejected and they are kept even away from the peripheral region of the hierarchy. Home range is all organisms have a suitable living place for themselves in their habitat called home range. Home range is an area in which an animal lives, performs all its activities and is not aggressive. It may or may not be defended partially or totally. It may be overlapping with the home range of the other individuals also. So, home range is a common property, whereas the territory is a private property of an individual or a social group. Territory is a more or less defended fixed area occupied by an individual or a social unit based mainly for feeding, mating, or the nesting purpose. The territorial behavior is found amongst insect, fish, bird, and some mammals. Functions of territory are uniform dispersion of the organisms over a given area or a habitat to increase individual fitness of the animals of a population, for the ecosystem balance and the population regulation in an ecosystem. The territory holders are aggressive, including the advertisement by scent, song, threats, roar, or attack to exclude the intruder. For example, in male ring-tailed lemur have a scent gland on their wrist, chest, and the genital area. During the encounter with the rival, the males may perform ritualized aggression by having a sting fight. The mate rubs its tail on the chest or the ribs and arches it to challenge. A large number of theories have been proposed to explain the territorial behavior in the individual. The most accepted theories are the elastic disk theory and the habitat suitability theory. According to the elastic disk theory, territory is like an elastic disk that can expand or squeeze depending on the size of the population. For example, the flies maintain a territory along the edge of a pond. When the population density is relatively low, the individuals are spaced 3 to 7 meters apart. The aggressive interaction is frequent. When the density increases, the individuals are spaced less than half meter apart. Territoriality breaks down. The example supports the hypothesis that territory is an elastic disk and can expand or squeeze depending upon the population size. Habitat suitability explains that each individual will try to choose the optimum habitat where its chances of survival and the success of reproduction is highest. When the most suitable habitat is occupied, then the other remaining individuals, they occupy the suboptimum habitat. Thus, a habitat has its maximum suitability when the population density is zero. At low levels of population density, only the optimum habitat is occupied. Further increase in density will result in the spread of the population over the suboptimum and the peripheral region. The unsettled individuals may migrate out, and this is called e-migration or dispersal of individuals to the new unoccupied areas. They may founder population in another region. As it is clear in this slide, you can see the increase in the population of the crabs, shorebirds, and the terrestrial animals like elephants. When the population density is increased, they move out and go in search of a new area for themselves. This was explained by Chitty and is commonly called as the Chitty's hypothesis, and he had studied it with reference to the population or distribution of rodents. According to his hypothesis, when a new area is occupied by a population, all the niches are vacant, they are available to it. As a result, the population growth is very rapid and they increase very rapidly to occupy all the vacant niche. As a result of this, there is increased population density leading to the mutual interference. The mutual interference in the population leads to the reduced population growth, and some of the individuals are pushed out of this area and they may migrate out to go at refuge somewhere else. The remaining individuals show reduced rate of reproduction and increased rate of mortality. The reduced rate of reproduction and increased mortality leads to a selection of the species in their behavior. As a result, they get sufficient good niche for their survival and their population starts increasing again because there is no mutual interference or there is a reduction in the mutual interference by the other individuals. As a result of this, there is again an increase in the reproduction and the population starts increasing in number and it again goes to the peak values. Modern synthesis of population regulation concept theory. With the increase in the biodiversity and ecosystem, the various regulatory mechanisms become interlinked and difficult to separate as the growth and the density regulatory processes. C.J. Kreb has simplified them in 3 steps. 1. Limitations. 2. Regulations. And 3. The evolutionary implications of self-regulation through group selection or natural selection. Limitations to the population growth and density are due to the various limiting factors. The limiting factors produce a change in the average equilibrium density of a population. For example, the equilibrium density of asymptote is different in the presence or absence of a parasite or a disease. Regulation of population density around the asymptote is a function of its percentage mortality caused by the various factors. For example, a disease may be a regulating factor when it becomes epidemic at high population density. The evolutionary implications of group selection was explained by Pimentel. He explained the role of genetic changes in the population regulation. He explained it by giving the example of coevolution in rust and its resistant varieties of wheat, myxomatosis and rabbit interaction in Australia. In Australia, rabbits were introduced and they were evolving in their own direction. When virulent virus of myxomatosis was introduced in Australia, initially the population of rabbits started declining very rapidly. But then after some time, it was observed that both the rabbit population and myxomatosis population, they evolved in their own direction. The virus became less virulent and even the rabbit became more resistant. Natural selection favored it so that both the populations could coexist for a longer duration and they could sustain and maintain themselves. This theory of group selection was given by Wien Edward to explain the self-regulatory mechanism on the basis of co-evolution of host and parasite. Of course, this is basically the genetic basis for the self-regulation of a population. So students, let's summarize what have we learned in this module. Populations are dynamic and very rarely they remain constant in nature. The population density regulatory mechanisms can be intrinsic or extrinsic. The extrinsic mechanisms include all the physical and the climatic factors. The effect of overcrowding and intra-specific competition for food and space is an intrinsic mechanism. Competition for food are described as contest or interference or scramble type. The competition for space leads to the territorial behavior and the development of a social hierarchy amongst the individuals of the same population. A population, when regulated by the harmful effect of parasites, predators, or competition, is called as the top-down process, whereas when it is regulated by the limits of food supply, it is known as bottom-up process. Lions are subjected to both the types of factors. The modern concept of population regulation is the evolutionary and genetic approach explained by the group selection theory. The theory of group selection was given by Wien Edward to explain the self-regulation. For example, co-evolution of host and parasite relationship was explained on the genetic basis of self-regulation. Thank you.